A simple request whispered in a marble hallway was enough to expose the emptiness behind a millionaire's gilded life. Richard Calloway, a man who could purchase islands, influence elections, and command armies of employees with a single phone call, found himself standing frozen outside his daughter's bedroom door, listening to words that shattered his carefully constructed world. The voice belonged to his 8-year-old son, trembling with a vulnerability Richard had never heard before. But it wasn't what the boy asked for that stopped his heart, it was who he asked. In a house filled with every luxury money could buy, his children were begging the housekeeper for the one thing their father had never thought to give them. Why did this man, who had built a real estate empire from nothing, who negotiated billion-dollar deals before lunch, find himself paralyzed by a child's innocent request? The answer lies in a story of forgotten priorities, a woman who understood what truly mattered, and a reckoning that would force him to confront the cost of his success. The Kingdom of Glass and Stone. The Calloway estate sprawled across 12 pristine acres in the rolling hills of Westridge, Connecticut, a monument to what 20 years of ruthless ambition could build. The main residence was an architectural marvel, a modern fortress of floor-to-ceiling windows, imported Italian marble, and angular steel beams that jutted toward the sky like declarations of conquest. Architectural Digest had featured it twice. Luxury Living magazine called it a masterclass in contemporary opulence. 3 separate wings radiated from the central great room, the master's suite to the east, where Richard and his wife Vanessa maintained separate bedrooms connected by a shared closet the size of most people's apartments, the children's wing to the west, where 15-year-old Olivia and 8-year-old Christopher each had bedroom suites larger than many family homes, and the staff quarters to the north, tucked discreetly behind the kitchen and service areas where the machinery of daily luxury hummed invisibly. Outside, the grounds were equally impressive. An infinity pool seemed to cascade into the valley below, its water kept at a constant 78 degrees year-round. The tennis court had professional-grade lighting for evening matches Richard never played. The 7-car garage housed a collection that included a vintage Aston Martin, a Tesla Model X, and a Bentley Continental that Richard drove to important meetings when he wanted to project old-money sophistication rather than new-tech disruption. On this particular Tuesday morning in late October, Richard Calloway stood in his third-floor home office, phone pressed to his ear, watching dawn break over the Connecticut hills. The sky was performing its daily miracle, deep purples giving way to brilliant oranges and golds, but Richard's attention was on the voice coming through his phone, not the beauty outside his window. "Leonard, I don't care what the preliminary assessment says." Richard's voice was low, controlled, the tone of a man who'd learned that volume was unnecessary when you held all the cards. "We both know that property is worth $72 million, not $68. If Morrison Properties wants to play hardball, I have 3 other development groups who'll jump at the chance to partner on the Boston project." He paced in front of the window, his reflection ghost-like against the sunrise. At 47, Richard still cut an impressive figure, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way that projected authority rather than age. His morning uniform was consistent, pressed white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, charcoal slacks, no tie yet. The tie came later, after the first 3 deals of the day were closed. "That's what I thought," Richard continued, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Tell them 72, and we'll have contracts drawn up by Friday." "Good. Send the preliminary terms to my office by 9. He ended the call and checked his watch, 6:47 a.m. The Boston deal was just the appetizer. Today's main course was a zoning board meeting at 7:45, followed by a conference call with investors in his Singapore development at 9 o'clock, lunch with the mayor to discuss tax incentives at 12:30, and an evening flight to Chicago for meetings tomorrow. His assistant, a terrifyingly efficient woman named Patricia, had scheduled his entire week in 15-minute increments. Through the window, Richard could see the children's wing, still mostly dark except for a single light in Christopher's room. The boy was an early riser, probably already awake and reading one of his books about space or dinosaurs or whatever 8-year-olds were interested in these days. Olivia's room was dark. She'd sleep until the last possible moment before school, then emerge in a flurry of teenage drama about having nothing to wear despite a closet that rivaled a department store. Richard's desk phone buzzed. Patricia's voice, crisp and professional even at 6:48 a.m., came through the speaker. "Mr. Calloway, good morning. Your 7:15 with the zoning board has been pushed to 7:45. Also, Mrs. Chen called the office line asking to confirm Christopher's afternoon schedule. She said his piano lesson was cancelled and wanted to know if you'd prefer she arrange an alternative activity." Mrs. Chen. Elena Chen. The housekeeper. Richard felt a familiar flicker of mild irritation, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Elena was exceptional at her job, perhaps too exceptional. She'd been with them for 6 years, came with impeccable references, and ran the household with such seamless efficiency that Richard rarely had to think about domestic matters at all. But something about her constant presence, her quiet competence, occasionally needled at him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "Tell her to handle it however she sees fit," Richard said, pulling his tablet toward him to review the zoning board presentation. "She knows Christopher's schedule better than anyone." She also mentioned, Patricia continued carefully, that she'd like to discuss Olivia's recent mood changes. Apparently there's been some concern from her teachers. Richard looked up from the tablet, frowning. "Mood changes? Olivia's fine. She's 15. Teenagers have moods. That's what I told Mrs. Chen, but she was quite insistent that you might want to. Patricia, I pay Elena an excellent salary to manage the household, which includes dealing with teenage mood swings. If there's a serious problem, the school would contact me directly. Now, do you have the Morrison financials I asked for?" "On your desk, sir." "Red folder." "Perfect. Anything else?" A slight pause. "No, sir." "Have a productive morning." Richard ended the call and turned his attention to the red folder, Elena Chen and teenage moods already forgotten. This was how his days worked, a constant stream of decisions, negotiations, problems to solve, all requiring his attention, none of them leaving room for the mundane concerns of household management. That's what he paid people for. If the Calloway estate was a kingdom, then Elena Chen was its true ruler, though she wore her crown invisibly. She arrived every morning at 6:45 a.m. through the service entrance, parking her modest Honda Civic beside the gardener's truck and the pool maintenance van. At 53, Elena moved with the efficiency of someone who understood that time was the most valuable resource she possessed. Her uniform was self-imposed and practical, dark slacks, comfortable shoes, and simple blouses in neutral colors. Her black hair, shot through with dignified streaks of silver, was always pulled back in a neat bun. She wore minimal makeup and no jewelry except a thin gold wedding band she'd never removed, even though her husband had been gone for 7 years. Elena's story was one she rarely shared. She'd been born in San Francisco to immigrant parents who ran a small restaurant in Chinatown. She'd married young, to a kind man named David who taught high school history and made her laugh. They'd had one daughter, Michelle, who'd been the center of their universe. The plan had been simple: David would teach, Elena would work as a private chef, and they'd save enough to put Michelle through college and maybe, someday, open their own small restaurant. Then David had a heart attack at 42, sudden and massive, while coaching the school's debate team. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. 2 years later, Michelle, bright, beautiful, 23-year-old Michelle who'd just finished her master's degree, died in a car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. A drunk driver, wrong place, wrong time, a life extinguished in an instant. Elena had survived, though some days she wasn't sure how. She'd sold their small house in San Francisco, packed up her entire life, and moved across the country to Connecticut, where no memories lurked around every corner. She'd taken a job through a prestigious domestic agency, and that's how she'd found the Calloways. For 6 years, she'd poured all the love she had nowhere else to put into this house, and especially into the 2 children who lived in it. This morning, like every morning, Elena entered through the kitchen and immediately began her routine. She started coffee, the expensive dark roast Richard preferred, made in the French press he liked but never cleaned himself. She checked the refrigerator inventory, noting they were low on the organic strawberries Olivia loved and the specific brand of string cheese Christopher would actually eat. She made a mental note to add them to tomorrow's grocery delivery. By 7 a.m., she had the kitchen transformed into something warm and alive. Pancake batter sat ready in a bowl. She'd add fresh blueberries when Christopher came down, the way he liked them. A smoothie bowl for Olivia was already prepared in the refrigerator, topped with granola, sliced almonds, and fresh fruit arranged in a pattern Elena knew the girl would photograph for her Instagram before eating. The kitchen was Elena's favorite room in the house, despite, or perhaps because of, its intimidating grandeur. The La Corne range, which cost more than her car, had taken her weeks to fully master. The marble countertops stretched for what seemed like miles. The two Sub-Zero refrigerators held enough food to feed a small restaurant. But Elena had made it her own, adding small touches Richard and Vanessa never noticed: fresh herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill, a ceramic container of wooden spoons she'd brought from her old life, a small radio that played classical music softly while she worked. At 7:18 a.m., she heard the familiar soft padding of feet on the stairs. Christopher appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in his space-themed pajamas, his dark hair sticking up in the back. He was clutching Peanuts, the stuffed elephant that had been his constant companion since he was 3. At 8 years old, Christopher was supposed to be too old for stuffed animals, but Elena had never suggested he give Peanuts up. Some comforts were worth keeping. "Good morning, sunshine," Elena said, her voice genuinely warm. After 6 years, these children felt like hers in all the ways that mattered. Christopher's face lit up, a transformation that never failed to move her. "Morning, Elena. Is that pancake batter?" "It is indeed. With blueberries, if you'd like." "Yes, please." Christopher climbed onto one of the kitchen stools, setting Peanuts carefully beside him. "Can I help?" "You can tell me about your day. What's on the agenda for Tuesday?" And Christopher talked. Really talked. He told her about his friend Marcus, who'd brought a praying mantis to school for show and tell, and how it had escaped and caused chaos during math class. He talked about the science project he was working on, a volcano that he was determined to make actually realistic, not like those baby ones with baking soda. He told her about his piano practice, and how he'd finally mastered the tricky part in the piece he was learning for the winter concert. Elena listened with her full attention, asking questions, laughing at his stories, remembering every detail. She knew Marcus was Christopher's best friend, but also that Christopher worried Marcus liked another boy, Tyler, better. She knew the volcano project was due next Friday and that Christopher was anxious about the presentation part. She knew about the piano concert because she'd seen it on the school calendar, a calendar she checked religiously, even though neither Richard nor Vanessa seemed to look at it anymore. At 7:34 a.m., Olivia appeared, moving with the languid energy of a teenager who resented mourning on principle. She was tall for 15, with her father's height and her mother's elegant bone structure. This morning she wore ripped jeans and an oversized sweater, her long dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her face bare of makeup except for a touch of mascara. "Morning," Olivia mumbled, sliding onto a stool and immediately reaching for her phone. "Morning, sweetheart," Elena said, placing the smoothie bowl in front of her. "I added extra blueberries. I know they're your favorite." Olivia looked up, and her expression softened slightly. "Thanks, Elena. You didn't have to." "I know. I wanted to." For a few minutes, they ate in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who know each other well. Elena packed Christopher's lunch while they ate, using the special containers he preferred, including a note she'd written on a napkin with a silly drawing of an elephant. Christopher loved finding her notes. He'd shown her a shoebox under his bed where he kept all of them. It was 7:52 when Olivia spoke again, her voice careful. "Elena? Can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey. Anything." Olivia hesitated, twirling her spoon through her smoothie. "There's this art exhibition on Saturday at the Harborview Community Gallery. It's for young artists, and my piece got selected. It's going to be displayed." Elena set down the sandwich she'd been wrapping and turned to face Olivia fully. "Olivia, that's wonderful. Your abstract piece? The one with the blues and golds?" Olivia's eyes widened. "You remember that?" "Of course I remember. You worked on it for weeks. I remember you saying the gold was supposed to represent hope breaking through darkness." Elena smiled. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." "The winter concert. At school. It's next Wednesday at 6:30. His voice got smaller. "I have a piano solo. It's not a big deal or anything, but would you maybe want to come to that too?" Elena had to swallow past the lump in her throat. These children, asking her, the housekeeper, to attend their events like she was their mother. It broke her heart and filled it simultaneously. "Christopher, I would love to come to your concert. I can't wait to hear your solo." Both children beamed at her with such pure, uncomplicated joy that Elena had to turn away briefly to compose herself. When she turned back, she was smiling, but inside, she felt the familiar ache of loving children who weren't hers, who had parents who simply weren't there. What she didn't know was that Richard Calloway was standing in the hallway just out of sight, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth, listening to his children make plans with the help. What she didn't know was that everything was about to change. The night before. To understand the full weight of what Richard heard that Tuesday morning, we have to go back 24 hours, to Monday evening at 8:47 p.m. Richard had just returned from Manhattan, where he'd spent 6 hours in meetings with a consortium of investors interested in his Chicago residential tower project. It had been a productive day, $42 million in commitments, 3 new partnership agreements, and enough momentum to move forward with the next phase. He'd celebrated with the investors over dinner at Per Se, where they'd worked their way through a tasting menu that cost more than Elena's monthly salary and multiple bottles of wine that cost more than her car payment. Richard had been in an excellent mood as his driver navigated the evening traffic back to Westridge. He'd reviewed documents on his tablet for most of the ride, making notes, sending emails, staying productive even in transit. This was how he lived, every moment optimized, every hour yielding returns. Vanessa wasn't home. She'd left for Arizona on Saturday, something about a wellness retreat, sound baths, meditation. Richard had approved the expense without really listening to the details. Their marriage had evolved over 15 years into something more resembling a business partnership than a romance. They attended events together, presented a united front for the children's schools, and maintained the appearance of an intact family unit. But the warmth had bled out years ago, replaced by careful politeness in separate bedrooms. The house was quiet when Richard entered at 8:30 p.m. Elena had left for the evening. She typically worked from 6:45 a.m. until 6 p.m., Monday through Friday, with occasional evening or weekend hours when needed. The kitchen was immaculate, dinner prepared and waiting in the warming drawer with detailed reheating instructions. There was a note on the counter in Elena's neat handwriting: Christopher finished his homework and had dinner at 6 o'clock. Olivia ate at 5:30 before leaving for her study group, should be home by 9 o'clock. Both children were reminded about bedtimes. Sleep well. Richard had eaten the prepared meal, some kind of herb-crusted chicken with roasted vegetables, while standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone. He barely tasted it. At 8:45, he'd headed upstairs to his office, intending to review the Chicago project financials before bed. His route took him past the children's wing, and that's when he'd heard the voices, low, conspiratorial, coming from behind Christopher's partially open door. Richard had stopped. He didn't make a conscious decision to eavesdrop, something in the tone of the voices had simply arrested his movement. "Do you think she'd say yes?" That was Christopher's voice, small and hopeful in a way that made Richard's chest feel strange. "I don't know." Olivia, trying to sound mature but unable to hide her own uncertainty. "Maybe we shouldn't ask. What if it's weird? What if she thinks we're being inappropriate or something? But Dad pays her to help us with stuff, right? And she's always nice. She came to your art thing last month. That was different. That was during her regular hours. This is asking her to come on her own time." That's like asking for a favor. A personal favor. There was a pause, and Richard stood frozen in the hallway, his hand hovering near the doorknob, not quite touching it. "I just want someone to be there," Christopher said, and his voice cracked slightly in that way children's voices do when they're trying not to cry. "Everyone else always has someone. Marcus's mom comes to everything. Tyler's dad coaches his soccer team. Even Jenny has her grandma who comes to all her stuff." "I know," Olivia whispered. "I know, Chris. Mom's never there. She's always at some retreat or spa or fundraiser thing. And Dad." Christopher trailed off. "Dad's busy," Olivia finished, but her voice held a flatness that suggested this was an explanation she'd given up believing. "He's always busy. He didn't even know about my science fair project last month," Christopher said quietly. "I got second place, and I told him about it at dinner, and he said that's nice, buddy, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. He was looking at his phone." Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach. He remembered that dinner, vaguely. Remembered Christopher saying something about school. He'd been reading an urgent email from the Singapore team about permit delays. What had Christopher been talking about? A science project? "He doesn't come to anything anymore," Olivia said, and there was an edge of old hurt in her voice. "Last year he missed my art show, my debate tournament, and parent-teacher conferences. He sent his assistant to the last one." His assistant, Chris. How pathetic is that? "Maybe he'd come if we asked him directly," Christopher suggested, but even he sounded doubtful. "You think I haven't tried? Last month I specifically told him about the art show 3 times. I put the invitation on his desk. I sent him a calendar reminder. He still forgot. He was on a plane to Seattle, apparently." Seattle. Richard remembered that trip. A crucial meeting about the Portland development. There had been something else that day, hadn't there? Something he'd meant to, but the Seattle meeting couldn't be rescheduled, and... "So what do we do?" Christopher asked. "Just accept that nobody's coming?" Another pause. Then Olivia, carefully, "What if we asked Elena? The housekeeper? Would she even want to come? She came to my art show last month, remember? She took pictures and everything. She made a whole big deal about how proud she was of me. And she puts your drawings on the refrigerator." "Dad doesn't even look at the refrigerator," Christopher observed sadly. "I know. But Elena does. She sees everything. Do you think she'd come to my concert? It's on a Wednesday evening. That's technically her day off in the evenings. I think..." Olivia paused. "I think she might say yes. Because she actually cares about us. Not because she has to. Not because she's getting paid. But because she actually cares. Should we ask her tomorrow? At breakfast?" "Yeah. Tomorrow. Before Dad comes down. Before Dad comes down." As if Richard were some peripheral figure, not the man who provided every single thing they had. Richard had backed away from the door silently, his heart pounding in a way that felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He'd made it to his bedroom, closed the door, and stood there in the dark for a long moment, still in his suit, tie hanging loose around his neck. On his nightstand was a framed photograph, a professional shot taken 4 years ago on a family vacation to Turks and Caicos. All 4 of them on a perfect beach, perfect smiles, perfect clothes. It had cost $60,000 for a week. Richard remembered spending most of it on conference calls, annoyed that the villa's Wi-Fi was unreliable. He'd sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, that photograph in his hands, listening to the silence of his enormous house. His children weren't asking him to come to their events. They were asking the housekeeper. Because she showed up. Because she cared. Because somewhere along the way, she'd become more present in their lives than he was. Richard had spent 20 years building an empire, accumulating wealth, creating security for his family. And his children were begging the help to attend their school concerts. He'd gone to his office and pulled up his calendar, scrolling back through 6 months of entries. Meetings, conferences, site visits, investor dinners, flights to Chicago and Seattle and Boston and Singapore. Not a single school event. Not one soccer game. Not one piano recital. Not one parent-teacher conference. Patricia had probably received all the invitations, all the reminders. She probably had a system for politely declining on his behalf, for sending his regrets, for maintaining his schedule. He paid people to handle things. That's what successful people did. But nobody could handle being a father for him. And by the time he'd realized that, it was too late. His children had found someone else to fill that role. Richard hadn't slept that night. He'd sat in his office until dawn, staring at his calendar, listening to the silence, and feeling something crack open in his chest that he didn't have words for. The morning after. Which brought him to Tuesday morning, standing in the hallway at 7:15 a.m. with a cup of coffee, positioning himself where he could see into the kitchen without being immediately visible. He felt ridiculous. A 47-year-old man, worth north of $200 million, hiding in his own home to spy on his housekeeper and his children. But he needed to see it for himself. Needed to witness what they'd talked about. At 7:18, Christopher came down, and Richard watched the boy's entire face transform when he saw Elena. That smile, pure, uncomplicated joy. When was the last time Christopher had smiled at him like that? He watched Elena listen to Christopher with complete attention, asking questions about his day, his friends, his interests. He watched her remember details about Christopher's life that Richard couldn't even recall being told. When Olivia came down, Richard saw the same thing. His guarded, often sullen teenage daughter opened up to Elena in ways she never did with him. There was trust there. Comfort. Safety. And then came the questions. The requests. When Christopher asked Elena about the piano concert, his voice nervous and hopeful, Richard felt his hands tighten around his coffee cup. When Elena agreed without hesitation, when Christopher's face lit up with pure happiness, Richard felt that crack in his chest widen. When Olivia asked about the art exhibition, her voice trying so hard to sound casual, to not reveal how much the answer mattered, Richard had to steady himself against the wall. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," Elena had said. And both of his children had looked at her with such love, such gratitude, such relief at being seen and valued. They looked at the housekeeper the way children should look at their parents. Richard stood in that hallway long after the children had finished breakfast and headed upstairs to get ready for school. He stood there after Elena had cleaned up, humming softly to herself as she worked. He stood there until his coffee was cold and his 7:45 meeting was only minutes away. His phone buzzed. "Patricia, Mr. Calloway, the car is ready for the zoning board meeting." Richard looked at his phone, then at the kitchen where Elena was wiping down the counters, then at the stairs where his children were getting ready for school. He had a zoning board meeting that could affect a $30 million project. He had a conference call with Singapore that couldn't be rescheduled. He had lunch with the mayor that had taken 3 weeks to arrange. He had a life that demanded his presence, his attention, his time. But for the first time in 20 years, Richard Calloway found himself wondering what exactly he'd built his empire for, if the people who were supposed to be at its center had learned to find what they needed somewhere else. His children didn't need his money. They needed him. And they'd stopped asking. The question that would haunt him for the next few weeks was simple but devastating. Was it too late to change? Or had he already lost them to the warmth of someone else's consistent love? He didn't know. But standing in that hallway, listening to his children laugh with the woman who'd become the mother they needed, Richard Calloway realized he was about to find out. Because something had to change. The only question was whether he could change fast enough. The days following Richard's awakening moved in a strange, disorienting blur. For a man who'd spent 2 decades operating with absolute certainty, he suddenly found himself adrift in his own home, an outsider looking in on lives he thought he understood. Wednesday morning, he canceled a Chicago trip. Patricia's voice had carried a note of alarm when he'd called at 6 a.m. with the instruction. In 15 years, Richard Calloway had never canceled a business trip for personal reasons. "Sir, the investors are flying in specifically to meet with you. We've been planning this for..." "Reschedule it," Richard had said, his voice firm. "Tell them something came up. Family emergency." It wasn't a lie. This was an emergency, even if he couldn't explain it to Patricia or anyone else. Instead of flying to Chicago, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He stayed home and watched. He watched Elena arrive at 6:45 a.m., her movements practiced and efficient. He watched her prepare breakfast with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine care, not just doing a job, but nurturing the people she served. Christopher's blueberry pancakes arranged in a smiley face. Olivia's smoothie bowl with the fruit arranged in a pattern he knew his daughter would photograph. He watched his children come downstairs and light up when they saw her. That transformation in their faces, it was like watching flowers turn toward the sun. And he watched them talk to her. Really talk. About their fears, their excitements, their small daily victories and defeats. Things they never told him anymore. Thursday, he worked from home again, positioning himself in various locations throughout the house where he could observe without being obvious. He saw Elena help Christopher with his math homework at the kitchen table, patiently explaining fractions in 3 different ways until the concept clicked. He saw her talk Olivia through a friendship crisis with a wisdom and gentleness that made his daughter's shoulders relax, made her smile return. He saw her put a fresh bouquet of flowers in the hallway, not expensive arrangements like Vanessa ordered for the formal rooms, but simple daisies from the farmer's market that made the space feel warm rather than impressive. He saw her pause at the refrigerator, looking at Christopher's drawings that covered every available magnetic surface. She stood there for a full minute, studying a crayon rendering of a spaceship, smiling softly to herself before moving on to start dinner preparations. Friday evening, Richard did something unprecedented. When Elena was preparing to leave at 6 p.m., he intercepted her in the kitchen. "Elena, do you have a moment?" She turned, surprised to see him. In 6 years, Richard had rarely sought her out for conversation beyond logistical matters. "Of course, Mr. Calloway. Is something wrong?" "No. I just..." He hesitated, suddenly unsure how to proceed. "I wanted to thank you. For everything you do for the children. I've noticed. I've been observing this week, and I see how much they depend on you." Elena's expression became carefully neutral. "It's my pleasure, sir. They're wonderful children." "They are," Richard agreed. "And I'm realizing I don't know them as well as I should." "As well as you do." A long pause hung between them. Elena chose her words carefully. "Mr. Calloway, if I may speak frankly." "Please. Your children don't need more things. They don't need bigger vacations or more expensive gifts or additional tutors." Her voice was gentle but firm. "They need you. Your time. Your attention. Your presence at the moments that matter to them." Richard felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. "I know. I'm beginning to understand that." Christopher's concert is Wednesday evening, Elena continued. Olivia's art exhibition is Saturday afternoon. Those aren't business meetings you can reschedule. Those are moments. And once they pass, they're gone forever. "I know," Richard said quietly. "I'm going to be there. Both events. I'm going to start being there." Elena studied him for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her expression, hope, maybe, mixed with cautious skepticism. "I hope you mean that, Mr. Calloway. Because those children have learned to stop hoping their father will show up. It would be cruel to disappoint them again." With that, she gathered her things and left, leaving Richard standing alone in the kitchen, her words echoing in his mind. The concert. Wednesday evening arrived with the weight of a final exam Richard hadn't studied for. He'd told Patricia to clear his entire evening, no calls, no emails, no emergencies unless the building was literally on fire. He'd left the office at 5:30 p.m., something he hadn't done in years. The elementary school auditorium was smaller than he'd expected, already filling with parents and families by the time he arrived at 6:15. The air smelled of floor polish and that indefinable scent of children's spaces, crayons and paper and innocence. Richard found a seat in the middle section, suddenly nervous in a way that billion-dollar negotiations had never made him. Around him, other parents chatted easily, many of them clearly knowing each other from previous events. Richard realized he'd never been part of this community, never attended enough events to become a familiar face. At 6:25, Elena arrived. She spotted him immediately, her eyebrows rising in genuine surprise. She made her way over, sitting in the empty seat beside him. "Mr. Calloway. I didn't expect to see you here." "I told you I'd come," he said quietly. "People say a lot of things." But her voice had softened slightly. The lights dimmed. The principal gave a brief welcome. The concert began. Richard watched children younger than Christopher perform simple pieces, their small hands sometimes fumbling on the keys, their parents applauding enthusiastically regardless. He watched Elena lean forward in her seat when the third-grade performers were announced, her entire attention focused on the stage. Then Christopher walked out. Richard's breath caught. His son looked so small up there under the stage lights, wearing the button-down shirt and slacks Elena must have helped him pick out. Christopher's eyes scanned the audience, and Richard saw the exact moment they found him. The boy's mouth fell open. His eyes went wide. He looked at his father, then at Elena, then back at his father, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Richard raised his hand in a small wave, trying to smile in a way that said, "I'm here. I'm finally here." Christopher's face transformed, shock giving way to the brightest, most beautiful smile Richard had ever seen on his son's face. The boy was practically glowing as he sat at the piano. The piece Christopher played was called River Dance, and Richard didn't know enough about music to judge its technical difficulty. But he watched his son's hands move across the keys with a confidence and grace he hadn't known the boy possessed. He watched Christopher's face, concentrated but joyful, lost in the music. And when it was over, when the audience applauded, Richard stood up. He stood and clapped until his hands hurt, and he saw Christopher looking at him with tears in his eyes, smiling so wide his face might split. After the concert, in the crowded hallway where families clustered, Christopher ran to them. Not to Elena first, as Richard had expected, but to him. "Dad! You came! You actually came!" Richard dropped to one knee, not caring about his expensive suit or the other families watching. "I wouldn't have missed it, buddy. You were incredible." "Really? You really think so?" "I know so. I'm so proud of you, Christopher." The boy threw his arms around Richard's neck, and Richard held him, feeling the small, solid weight of his son against his chest, and wondered how he'd gone so long without this. When Christopher finally pulled back, he turned to Elena. "Did you see, Elena? Dad came. He really came." Elena's eyes were bright, and when she looked at Richard, he saw something like cautious approval in her expression. "I saw, sweetheart. Both of us were here to see how wonderful you were. Both of us." The phrase struck Richard with its implications. Elena wasn't trying to take his place. She'd just been filling the space he'd left empty. Saturday afternoon, Richard cleared his schedule again. No golf with potential investors. No working lunch. No reviewing contracts in his office. The Harborview Community Gallery was a modest space in the Arts District, nothing like the high-end galleries where Vanessa bought pieces for their home. The opening was crowded with families, teenagers awkward in dressy clothes, younger siblings running between displays. Olivia's piece was in the center of the main room, impossible to miss. Richard stopped in front of it, genuinely stunned. It was an abstract canvas, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, done primarily in blues and golds. The bottom was heavy darkness, deep blues and blacks that seemed to pull the eye down. But rising from that darkness were streaks of gold, starting small and thin, then growing wider and brighter as they moved up the canvas, until the top third was an explosion of light. A small placard beside it read, Breaking Through, by Olivia Calloway, age 15. This piece explores the concept of hope emerging from darkness, the way we find light even in our deepest struggles. She's incredibly talented. Elena's voice came from beside him. She'd arrived just after him, had given him a small nod of acknowledgement before moving through the exhibition. I didn't know, Richard said, his voice rough. I didn't know she could do this. She's been painting for 3 years. She wanted to take advanced art classes, but you and Mrs. Calloway thought she should focus on AP courses that would look better for college applications. Richard closed his eyes. She asked me about that. I said art was a nice hobby but not practical for her future. Art is her future, Mr. Calloway. Or it could be, if someone encouraged it. Before Richard could respond, Olivia appeared, looking nervous in a way that made her seem younger than 15. She saw Elena first, and relief flooded her face. Elena. You came. Of course I came. I told you I would. Elena hugged her, then stepped back to gesture at the painting. Olivia, this is extraordinary. I'm so proud of you. Then Olivia saw Richard. She froze, her expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope but looked afraid to show itself. Dad? Hi, sweetheart. Richard tried to smile, but his throat was tight. Your piece is. Olivia, it's incredible. I had no idea you had this kind of talent. You came, she said, and her voice cracked. You actually came. I should have been coming all along, Richard said. I'm sorry I haven't been. But I'm here now. And I want to understand this, understand what you love about it. Will you tell me about your painting? Olivia looked at him for a long moment, and Richard saw his daughter weighing whether to believe him, whether to risk hoping. Finally, she nodded. Okay. So the bottom part, that's supposed to represent. For the next 20 minutes, Olivia talked about her art, her process, her inspirations. Richard listened with his full attention, asking questions, learning about this whole part of his daughter's life he'd been blind to. Elena watched from a few feet away, and when Richard glanced at her, she gave him the smallest nod of approval. It was a start. The reckoning. That evening, after both children were in bed, Richard sat in the kitchen, a room he usually passed through but never occupied. Elena had left hours ago, but the space still felt warm with her presence. On the refrigerator, among Christopher's drawings, was a new addition, a photograph Elena must have taken and printed. It showed Christopher at his piano, mid-performance, his face lit with concentration and joy. Richard pulled out his phone and called Vanessa in Arizona. Richard? Is something wrong? When are you coming home? He asked without preamble. Sunday evening, as planned. Why? We need to talk. About the children. About us. About what we've let our lives become. A long silence. Then, what brought this on? I went to Christopher's concert. And Olivia's art exhibition. You did? Vanessa sounded genuinely shocked. When was the last time either of us went to one of their events, Vanessa? When was the last time we actually parented our children instead of just providing for them? Another silence, longer this time. You're right, she said finally, her voice small. I've been avoiding everything. It was easier to schedule another retreat than to face how disconnected we've become. Elena shouldn't know our children better than we do, Richard said. She shouldn't be the one they turn to for everything that matters. That's our job. That's supposed to be us. So what do? We change, Richard said. We do better. Starting now. After he hung up, Richard sat in the kitchen for a long time. He thought about Elena, this woman who'd loved his children not because she was paid to, but because that's who she was. She'd given them something money couldn't buy, consistent, present, unconditional care. She'd shown him what he should have been all along. He couldn't undo the years of absence. Couldn't reclaim the moments he'd missed. But he could start showing up now. He could learn to be the father his children deserved. It wouldn't be easy. He'd have to restructure his priorities, delegate more at work, accept that some deals might not close because he wasn't available 24/7. But as he looked at Christopher's photograph on the refrigerator, at his son's joyful face, Richard realized something fundamental. His children didn't need a millionaire father who could buy them everything. They needed a present father who would show up for anything. Elena had been giving them that presence all along, filling a void she should never have had to fill. Now it was his turn. The question was whether his children would give him the chance, whether they'd risk hoping their father had finally learned what truly mattered. Richard didn't know. But for the first time in 20 years, he was going to try to find out. Because some things, presence, attention, love, couldn't be delegated or purchased. They could only be given, day after day, moment by moment. And Richard Calloway was finally ready to start giving them.